Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to go over the quiz questions on our first reading quiz that covered Gladwell. And you'll have the opportunity in this video to earn some extra points that I can add to your quiz total. And so for 3 of the questions, we're going to pause and you'll have a chance to answer some questions. And if you answer those correctly, I will add those extra points to your quiz score. Okay, and so how that's gonna work is I've added a new resource for us, and I'll show you where to locate it. So we're on our homepage here. If you scroll down, this is week 2. So week 2, right, focused on Gladwell. And so what I've done is I've annotated Gladwell's article, right? So we were practicing annotations in our hypothesis document, which will continue to be a helpful resource for us as we move to quiz 3, which is going to ask you to make connections between Gladwell and who, and also for the rough draft of the first paper, which is going to ask you to do the same thing, make those connections between the 2 texts. So you're going to be going back to the Gladwell text and going back and rereading it with who in mind, right? And vice versa, reading who with Gladwell in mind to brainstorm those connections. Okay, so this is intended then as kind of a model or sample of what annotations can look like. And just note that these annotations are actually ones I made on a second or third reading, right? So, you know, a lot of the annotations kind of mark out what Gladwell is doing in any given paragraph, right? So it kind of tracks the structure of the article. And so we only really become aware of the structure on the second or third or fourth or fifth reading, right? So just keep that in mind when you're reading through them. Okay, so just to give you a little preview here, right? So if you hover on the comments, you'll be able to see the annotations there, and it tracks us through. Okay. So what you'll be doing is we'll start the review. I'll go ahead and go over question 1 and show you a sample response that I copied and pasted from one of your quizzes. And we'll talk about what's working well there, what the strengths are, and then also how that response could have become even stronger, which will then lead us to look at a few different strategies we can use to make sure that our responses to the quiz questions are as strong as possible. Okay, and then when we get to question 2, that's when you'll have the opportunity to go to this document, to the annotated version of Gladwell's article, and read through my annotations and use those annotations to help you respond to the question I'm going to post in the video for you. Okay, and so we'll do that process for questions 2, 4, and 5. And we'll go over questions 1 and 3, and then also 5. And for questions 6 through 8, I think that you'll find if you read through the annotations that those annotations basically answer those particular questions 6 through 8. And you know, once you get your quizzes back, once they're graded and returned to you, then if you still have questions on those last 3 questions of the quiz, questions 6 through 8, then you can always stop by office hours and we can talk through that. Or you can also bring those questions up in our weekly meetings, which are starting this week, right? So group 1 is started today, Tuesday. And it's been really nice so far to get to see you face-to-face, one-on-one. And so I think that's going to be a really fruitful time and space for us. So remember to remind yourself of when those weekly meetings are. Okay, so just a moment here while I pull up our Okay, so here are the slides then, reviewing our first reading quiz. And after everyone completes this video activity, I will make these available to you on our Canvas homepages under resources and handouts. Okay, so again, just to review, strategies for being able to perform as best as possible on the quizzes. So, as we've been emphasizing, rereading is a crucial part of understanding the text, right? So, again, on a first reading, we can expect ourselves to understand about 10% of that text. On a second reading, about 30%, right? So, you're going to need to read multiple times in order to get closer and closer to understanding the article as deeply and complexly as possible. Okay, and then another strategy, so reviewing the annotations on hypothesis that we do, and also for our purposes here with Gladwell, reviewing the annotations that we're going to take a look at during this video. Okay, and lastly, the group work that we perform in the class period before the quiz is structured to prepare you for that quiz. So going back to the group work and reviewing it, I'll always leave some comments in the margins responding to what the groups have posted as their responses. So that's a good kind of study sheet. And all of these resources, again, will be really useful for you when we go to draft our first essay, which is coming up next week. Okay, and so when we take a look at question 1, so Gladwell writes, "The world, we are told, is in the midst of a revolution. So the new tools of social media have reinvented social activism." And so the questions for this were, A, how has social activism been reinvented? And B, why does Gladwell include the phrase "we are told" here, right? So this is a close reading question when we pull out some language, a word or a phrase from a quotation, and think about what the writer is indicating or implying or suggesting there. So those are going to be some of our common close reading verbs, right? Indicates, suggests, implies. So what does it suggest, close reading verb, about his attitude toward the view he is expressing? Right, towards this idea that we're in the midst of a revolution, that social media is revolutionizing or reinventing social activism. Okay, so for this one, I've copy and pasted a sample response from one of your quizzes. And so Gladwell begins this paragraph by stating his claim that social activism itself has been reinvented through the use of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms. The media and other users have created a new form of trying to bring change to society, or social activism, in other words. So Gladwell states, with Facebook and Twitter and the like, the traditional relationship between political authority and popular will has been upended, making it easier for the powerless to collaborate, coordinate, and give voice to their concerns. Okay, so one reason I selected this sample to show you is that the writer's done a good job of selecting a quotation to support their response, right? So essentially, this quotation is indicating how social media has changed social activism. Okay, and so that specific way that it's transformed or supposedly revolutionized is it upends again, right? The relationship between those in power, political authority, and the broader population, right? Gives them the space to voice their concerns. So those are all positive attributes of social media. Okay, and if we continue the response, the applications have changed the way we view social activism. Instead of taking action in person, we have come to express our opinions through these platforms to share them among the rest of the community on the internet. Okay, so one way that could become even stronger is to refer back more specifically to the information we get in the quotation, right? So this gets a little general here, right? It has changed the way we view activism. Well, how so? Specifically, how has it changed? What is Gladwell saying here? Instead of taking action in person, we express our opinions through these platforms. Um, you know, what does Gladwell say specifically about that? Maybe a little snippet of quotation to support that claim. Okay, and then we shift to part B of question 1. So Gladwell himself uses the phrase "we are told" to indicate to indirectly show his opinion that he does not agree with the world. capturing his claim about the new age of social activism. He's expressing a negative view towards this new form of trying to change society for the better by using Facebook and Twitter. And so the writer here successfully identifies that this phrase, we are told, this shouldn't have here, right? Just we are told, um, that is Gladwell kind of indicating that he's not in agreement with this particular view of social media and its ability to enact real world change. Okay, so some suggestions, right? So this is already, a solid response, and to make it even stronger, you know, one thing that we want to do is make sure we fully explain our reasoning and our answers, right? So it's kind of connecting all the dots rather than skipping from kind of A to D. Make sure we're going through B and C to get to D, and explaining that path to our reader. So, for example, we are told, right? So the writer here is just kind of saying we are told tells us he's critical, right? But it's not kind of clear to the reader exactly how that phrase we are told um, uh, means that he's criticizing, right? So we have to spell that out. So we are told indicates a close reading verb, that this is a view that others are telling us, right? We are told. So other people are telling us that social media is so great at enacting social change. And so he's saying, look, this isn't my view. This is what other people are telling us. And so by doing that, he's distancing himself from that view. And that ends up being the view of the digital evangelists, right? Those who think social media has become this great new tool, and that social media, or social activism rather, has changed for the better. From the forms of social activism we saw in the past before the internet and social media. Okay, so strategies for strong quiz responses then. So generally answer, support, explain. So with answering, you want to start in your own words. So in other words, you never want to just start with a quotation, right? So first kind of answer the question or begin answering it in your own words, and then support that answer with a carefully chosen quotation or two, right? And we saw that in the sample response. Okay, but then don't stop there. This third step to explain is the one that we, especially at the beginning of the semester, tend to forget, right? And this is a step that we tend to forget in our rough drafts when we start drafting our essays. When we look into those body paragraphs, we tend to have answer and support, but lack explanation. And so, as you're explaining what your quotation means and how it supports your answer, you want to make sure you're bringing in and defining key terms where relevant, right? And so one of the things we want to do, we want to make sure that our summaries and paraphrases, our representations of the ideas in the text are as specific as possible, as accurate as possible. And one way to do that is to engage the key terms of the text when relevant. Okay, so bring in those key terms and define them. And as you'll see, when you get to the annotated version of Gladwell, I pay a lot of attention to the key terms and how we know they're key terms, right? So one big clue that a key term is a key term is that it's repeated, right? Multiple times. And we see that with Gladwell. Okay, so bringing in those key terms, defining them, and then also being as specific as possible. So referring to particular details or examples from the text, right? So again, when we first read a text, our summaries or representations of the text tend to be really general, okay? And so we want to make those as detailed and specific as possible. Okay, so we'll pause there for a moment and I'll pull up question number 2. Okay, so I pulled up question number 2. So part A of that question, what does Gladwell mean by the phrase digital evangelism? In other words, what is evangelism and what makes the particular form of evangelism he is referring to digital? Okay, so for part A, right, so normally later in the semester, if you receive a question like this on a quiz, it's actually just going to have the first part. So what does Gladwell mean by the phrase digital evangelism? But here, since the beginning of the semester and we're learning these close reading skills, active reading skills, I wanted to kind of give you more structure. So basically, to answer that question fully, first you want to define, well, what's evangelism? right? And that's a great way to close read. Look that up in a dictionary, figure out what it means, what its associations are or connotations. And for evangelism, right, it's not just being enthusiastic about something or spreading the word, but it's a religious term, right? So kind of spreading the word of a particular religion, right? Being really enthusiastic about that. And so here, Gladwell is suggesting, right? Suggesting, close reading verb, that, you know, those who are so enthusiastic about social media's ability to um, facilitate social activism are are basically, they kind of have this sense of faith, right? So religious faith, right? It's just faith. So that we don't have any actual, um, you know, concrete evidence, right? For example, that God exists or a particular religion is truer than another one, right? It's a belief. It's a leap of faith. And so he's suggesting that it's kind of the same thing for social media, right? Social media has become this new religion, and people don't really have, you know, sound, strong, concrete evidence to back up that claim. It's a faith rather than kind of a proven fact, right? That social media is has not really truly been kind of proven to enact the kind of change that digital evangelists claim it can make. Okay, so you want to spell that all out, right? And so that's an example of close reading, right? What does you, he could have said something different, right? He could have said, instead of digital evangelism or a digital evangelist, he could have just said, um, people enthusiastic about social media's ability to engage in social activism, right? But the fact that he brings evangelism, there's so much packed into that word choice, right? So again, it suggests that, right, they're believing in it like a religion, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, spelling that out will give you a nice, right, full 5 points. Um, okay, and then B, so who is an example of a digital evangelist that he offers? And would Gladwell consider himself a digital evangelist? Okay, so here we're going to pause. So this is your first opportunity to earn some extra points for the quiz. Um, and so first, I'd like you to give me an example of a digital evangelist, or actually 3 examples of a digital evangelist, okay? And to help you do that, we're gonna pause. You're gonna go to this annotated version. Let me make sure I'm sharing that. Great, okay. So you're going to go back to Gladwell's small change that's annotated and read through those annotations. And I mark pretty much, I think I caught them all, every example that Gladwell uses of a digital evangelist. Okay, so just reading through those annotations will allow you to find 3 examples, and doing so will earn you some extra points on the quiz. Okay, so I'll pause and let you go through and dig into those annotations. Okay, so you've had a chance to roll through the annotations from the Gladwell article here. And so, yeah, there are several examples of digital evangelists, right? And so the perhaps the most apparent is in the paragraph that we've paid the most attention to, I think, when talking about Gladwell. So again, right, this idea that we're told by other people that social media is awesome in terms of social activism. And so basically in this paragraph, we're getting examples of digital evangelist viewpoints, right? And so Mark Feifel is our first example of a digital evangelist, right? Thinks Twitter should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And also James Glassman, right? Who told, right, cyber activists that they're kind of the best hope for the world in conquering Al-Qaeda, right, and terrorism. Okay, and here, right, when he switches to this paragraph, this is where Gladwell says, okay, I find that these views of social media are puzzling, right? They confuse me. And so we start to get an idea that he's critical of digital evangelists, right? And so he uses Morozov, who he refers to, right, as a critic of digital evangelism, to help him make his case, right, that those so enthusiastic about social media's capacity to enact social change um, are actually those ideas are overblown, right? And so Morozov, right, proves that okay, the so-called Twitter revolution, right, this Twitter revolution that I mentioned here, it's so-called, right? It wasn't actually a Twitter revolution. People misinterpreted that. Okay, and later in the paragraph, so Golnaz Asfardiari would be, like Morozov, a critic, right? Kind of saying, yeah, it's time to get Twitter's role right and what happened, right? So this wasn't a Twitter revolution. And then here we have Andrew Solomon, who championed the role of social media in Iran. So Solomon is an example of a digital evangelist, right? So according to Gladwell, by way of Morozov and Asfandiari, um, are saying, look, Sullivan didn't get it right, right? Okay, and then here in the next paragraph, this using the term grandiosity, right? Kind of saying, okay, so digital evangelists, their views are kind of grandiose, right? They're overblown. They're giving too much credit to social media as a tool for social activism. Okay, we scroll further down and we get a couple more examples of digital evangelists later in the article. So here, when we get to Smith and Acker, right? So again, the title of their book clues us in that they're digital evangelists, right? And so any good title is going to um, be basically a compressed version of the writer's thesis or argument, right? And so here, the dragonfly effect, so quick, effective, and powerful ways to use social media to drive social change. So in other words, Smith and Acker, as digital evangelists, they think that social media is effective and a powerful way to drive social change, right? So they view it positively. And they give the example of the Help Smear campaign. Um, right. And then Gladwell comes in and goes, okay, yeah, that's great. The example of Help Samir, but that's actually not true activism and the way that I'm thinking of it. Okay. Okay, and so going back through those annotations, figuring out, who's the digital evangelist and who's not, we find that Gladwell then aligns himself with Morozov. Um, And so he too then is a critic of these digital evangelists. So he wouldn't consider himself a digital evangelist. Okay, so we'll come back then to our quiz questions and take a look at question 3. Just a moment here.